Welcome to this Architecture Today webinar with programme partners Schu, Making Good, Adapting for the Future. Our panel of experts includes Andrew McEwan, Associate Director, Orms, Amy Punter, Associate Director, Hoare Lea, and Donald Matheson, Director, Matheson Whiteley. In a moment, your chair, Ruth Slavid, but first, Schu UK's Commercial Director, Sean Butler.
Welcome to the latest in our series of 80 Schu webinars. In today's webinar, we will discuss how we can adapt and renovate existing buildings to make them fit for purpose and be part of a net zero future. What has to change across the industry as a whole to incentivise retrofit approaches to new construction? Well, we have three expert speakers who will each give a short presentation to explain the context of their approach to the challenge of unlocking the potential of existing buildings and help us set the scene for today's discussion. This is a topic that fits squarely into the culture and business principles at Schu, where sustainable action is a crucial part of our corporate policy and strategic focus. We know that buildings cause a staggering 40% of the CO2 emissions and that the UK has the oldest building stock in Europe. We believe that it's crucial that there is a massive improvement in the energy efficiency of buildings, and we're committed to providing outstanding refurbishment products and solutions for sustainable buildings as part of any renovation and repair. I think today's discussion will raise many other highly relevant issues for all those interested in the current strategies being employed to maximise building performance. Thank you once again for joining us. I'll now pass you to Ruth, who's chairing today's event.
Thank you, Sean. Yes, and I'm sure this will raise lots of interesting questions. I know this is a subject that all of you are probably very interested in. I certainly am. So before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to tell you a little about how the morning is going to work. After each of our speakers' presentations, we will have time for just one or two questions, and then there will be a group discussion at the end. And what we need from you for that are your questions. So when something strikes you as interesting and you think, well, how on earth did they do that? Or surely they forgot that bit. Do send the question in and we will ask the most interesting and pertinent ones at the end. The discussion is really made good by how seriously you do that and take it. But with no further ado, I am going to introduce our first speaker, who is Andrew McEwan, who is an Associate Director at Orms. Andrew.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk to you about making good. At Orms, we've been making good for 38 years. We love working with existing buildings for a whole host of reasons. The emphasis is working with, not on, existing buildings, and hopefully that will become clear as I go through the slides today. Firstly, we really just love the challenge, the intricate problem solving and the process to getting to know the existing building and getting under the skin. We want to work on buildings that positively impact people and how they use them. We love to explore the intangible lived heritage of buildings, and we think it's incredibly powerful when you integrate that. And I think this Aldo Rossi quote here really sort of sums that up for us, that the idea of the power of collective memory, both within the city and within buildings, and how we can start to harness that. And research into this forms a big part of our designs. We also believe that reworking buildings is critical in tackling the climate emergency. 62% of the UK's waste comes from construction and demolition, and that's something as a profession we feel that we need to change. Today I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the Standard Hotel and 160 Old Street to share why and how we made good these two buildings. They're both buildings from a similar area, both completed originally in the 1970s. And we've taken two very different approaches to these buildings, but hopefully it'll help you understand today how and why we did these. We did what we did. Firstly, the Standard Hotel. We undertook this for one of our clients, Crosstree Real Estate Partners. They won the bid to essentially to purchase the hotel from Camden. It was a very interesting purchase process where everyone else was keeping the building as an office space. It had once been the annex to Camden's own council offices, and we were the only people that thought the limitations of the building actually best reflected a hotel use, and we were able to drive value through the building and kind of give it a new life by reimagining it as a hotel. And we were very lucky to bring on board a series of great collaborators. The interior designer Sean Houseman will touch on later, and they collaborated with interior architect Archer Humphreys. And obviously to have a great operator like the Standard, who had high ambitions with Cross Street to make the building an amazing exemplar for reuse. This was all made possible by Camden relocating their offices to a new purpose-built facility in King's Cross. This essentially funded the build of that, which was cost 26 million, and they sold the annex for 60 million. So it saved them £500,000 a year in running costs, and essentially gave them a new state-of-the-art facility. The annex itself, I say an annex, it was an annex to the 1930s Neo-Palladian Camden Town Hall that's immediately adjacent to the building. It was completed in the late 1970s and designed by Camden Council's in-house architecture team. It bore a striking resemblance to Seafort's International Press Centre in Schu Lane that was completed earlier in the 70s. And it was described by building design as self-effacing civic pride and order articulated by trendy 1960s quadrant cornered bays. So it received a really positive press throughout the years, but it had fallen into a bit of disrepair over time, and it was seen as a negative contributor to the local area. And it sits at a really interesting junction between the Bloomsbury Conservation Area immediately to the south of the building, and it's actually within the King's Cross Conservation Area. So we had to do a lot of work convincing Camden prior to the purchase to keep the building. Most people wanted to demolish it. And we had to convince the Down South East Review panel with us as well. In order to do so, we engaged with the 20th Century Society to get their support. We did a lot of research into the existing building and what the sort of merits and the original design intention was. I think this was best described by Edwin Heathcote, the Financial Times architectural critic, who described the building as a subtly compelling piece of architecture which appears more sophisticated the longer you look at it. He interestingly said that it was a building as an urban backdrop, but it has the potential to become foreground. And that, we thought, was a really interesting sort of starting point for us. How do we meet the client's aspirations and the building's latent potential and bring it to the foreground? So we looked about sort of how we would sort of break down the existing building and start to bring it to the foreground by working with the building's existing facades and fenestration and massing qualities to extend the building. There were sort of two key moves that helped to allow this extension. One of which was, on the left-hand picture here, the demolition of an existing wing of the building, the stair core that connected it to the Palladian building, and allow us to open up some public realm. And secondly was the addition of some new structure to the top of the building. We carefully weaved new structure through the existing waffle slabs, leaving the existing load-bearing precast facades unaffected. And we tried to do this in a really a really minimal surgical way here, where we tried to retain as much as possible of the existing structure and use the potential that lay within the building, meaning that we actually retained 94% of all the existing building structure, which is a really key goal of the project. The facade we cleaned up and repurposed it. We worked really hard to develop bespoke windows that were essentially matched the original sight lines of the original windows, we had to engage with a bolt manufacturer and metal worker, Midland Alloy, who made windows for boats, and we could use their system and profile to essentially achieve the tight radiuses and curved glass windows on it. There's one of the sort of amazing sort of forensic challenges that we had to go into here to try and deliver the authenticity back to the facade. And of course, dramatically we carved a new vertical, a new lift on the outside of the building with a red pill-shaped lift capsule. On top of the building we gave it a new crown, which, as I said, was based on the massing and articulation of the existing building, working with it and complementing it. This is built very simply through a simple curtain wall and stick system, and then has a series of PVD stainless steel, it's titanium coated stainless steel fins and cladding onto that, which gives it a sculptural form and depth. We reworked the entrance to the building. Actually, you would think usually most of the time you would naturally want to open up something. And in effect, we actually made the building slightly more solid at ground floor in certain areas. But what we did do was add a striking post-tension concrete entrance canopy, which we think is very much of its time but of its place. It feels like a modern insertion that's referential to the precast concrete facade behind. And we reinstated a pedestrian route to the south of the building, again removing a kind of overgrown garden and reinstating it with a new terrace space for the hotel bar, which members of the public can walk through now, and it's opened up the back of the site of the building. One of the things that we wanted to do here, had a real aspiration for, is for the building to be a destination, not just a hotel that the occupants would go to, that Londoners as a whole would go to, and would be used by the local community as well. And one of the things that the Standard has really done here is created a programme focused around building the local community, and has broad ranges, sort of inclusive cultural events as well within it. The existing town hall annex had a library at the ground floor, and that's something that's referenced within the design of the ground floor. You can see in the bottom left image there, the lounge space is actually a reimagined library, and that's where a lot of the debates and events is held. And we have lots of big sort of parties and after show parties in the top floor bar as well, which are really great fun. As I said, we worked with Sean Houseman and Archer Humphreys on the interior designs of the project. And I think that's really reflective of the sort of best type of collaborations you can have. The outcome of this, where everyone is incredibly happy with. The design concept behind this was really to port ourselves back to the 1970s and to sort of digest and pixelate the sort of transport narrative around King's Cross. So there's lots of references to underground maquettes and the modern Harris tweed upholstery. In certain areas, the carpets are a terrazzo of 1970s carpets, including that of the hotel in The Shining. So there's lots of fun and spectacle within the building. And Sean and the Standard's origin are obviously based in California, and this was wanted to be reflected in all the planting and outdoor areas. So there's a bit of Californian glamour overlooking the Euston Road and out to the south of London here, where you get amazing views over the city that aren't obstructed by any buildings. They're absolutely fantastic. As you get to the top of the building, that idea of glamour and real sort of flair and design are taken through the bar and restaurant Decimo and Sweeties on the top floor there, which has amazing views back across to St Pancras Station. So in summary, we like to think that we've helped retain a very fine piece of architecture. We've brought the building to the foreground, hopefully, everyone agrees with that, and we've created an attraction and energy to the south of the Euston Road. We've met the RIBA's 2050 whole life carbon targets, and created a place that engages with both people, culture and place. And I think this was kind of summed up by Jonathan Morrison, who said that he felt that we'd kind of used a sort of magic touch that was thought to have expired with Paul Daniels, which is a very nice quote, and one that we enjoyed. We thought the spirit of this quote evoked the spirit of the building, the spirit of tongue-in-cheek, and something that's not shy and retiring. So I'll move on to 160 Old Street, a very different project. Again, a 1970s building that was originally a Royal Mail sorting office and offices space that sits in the Old Street area, directly on Old Street. This is for the Great Portland Estates, and it's their sort of an interesting project for them, where they wanted to use it as a sort of test bed for technology within the offices, but to try and really push the envelope of what a refurbished building can deliver here. And contrary to the standard, we were a lot more aggressive in how we tackled the existing building. It was stripped primarily back to its core and concrete structural frame, and extended very heavily. You can see in the top left-hand picture there just how the building is transformed over the years. One of the challenges in the enabling works and demolition was the central wing of the building, where we discovered wood wool slabs within this area. Unfortunately, this meant we actually had to demolish the central wing from the first floor up, but we were in this discovery able to reuse the existing under-ream piles, and they were validated and reused at that point. So we were able to retain a lot of the existing structure here, and we had very limited strengthening works. As I said, the building was stripped back to its frame and cores, and new floors and cores were extended onto the building. One of the key moves that we made was to remove a ramp to the car park entrance. There was a basement car park in the scheme, and infill the site with a new entrance pavilion that you can see here in the bottom left. This was really key to unlocking the potential of the building. What we didn't want to do was remove all the cores. There was actually 2 lift banks within the building, when traditionally there's only one. And rather than sort of start to rip everything to high heaven there, we thought it was important to keep that, and actually creating this entrance pavilion ties the 2 lift cores together, creates a generosity and sense of arrival into the building. So we felt that was a way that we took a challenge and made it into an opportunity, and really helped to reframe the existing building there. And then the building was reclad with new brickwork and glazing. Again, we had to be very economical here. This was a building on a budget, and we kind of went to a lot of depths to understand how we could maximise what is essentially quite a thin, lightweight skin of masonry onto the building, and how we could use cappings and profiles and corbelling to try and give depth and quality to the building, and try and reimagine it away from the sort of flat brown and glass brick building that it once was. So we added a new exoskeleton around the perimeter to carry our new facade and extend the floor plate, so we could leverage more area and value for our client. We added a new frame to the top of the building to create 3 additional floors, and we replaced the central wing of the building. It's essentially in an E shape. We replaced that central wing where we found the wood wool slabs. This is the building in plan, a sort of typical floor here, and you can see that E shape that I referred to, and the two sort of banks of lifts that we have within the building. Again, it was really to just rework the cores and increase the WC provision, and remove any divisive structure. There was a large existing concrete shear wall that we took out, and that was supported by our exoskeleton around the outside. So where we were gaining area, we actually used it to make the internal space more palatable, but on the whole, the majority of the structure on floor was retained. One of the critical aspects was to reuse the basements. As I mentioned, there was a car park and loading bays in the basement, and we sought to open these up, and key to this was driving our courtyards down into the basement to try and create some sort of triple height and double height heroic spaces within that basement that really created a dynamic space with sort of ground feature with feature staircases that you can see here. So these are really kind of open industrial style spaces here. You can see that rather than being additive at the standard, we've been quite reductive here, and we've stripped back everything and tried to take the building as far back as we can and add in as little as possible. And these are now amazing spaces. This is now the UK and European headquarters for CNN, and there's filming and recording studios in this space. I talked about the pavilion building, which I've shown you here. This is a view looking south along the pavilion. You can see we've inserted a number of glazed brick sheer walls that divide off the entrance from some casual meeting spaces here and reflect the rhythm and grain of the existing structure on the right hand side. And revealing that existing structure wherever you were in the building, whether it's the shot blasting of the original concrete piers, to exposing the basement concrete structure, and even just revealing the terrazzo and the treads in the existing stairs. That's something that we thought was part of the building's DNA, and have sought to do it at every turn throughout the building. At this point, I'd like to say that these buildings have formed part of our journey of working with the existing buildings, something that we are constantly evolving and moving through. And we've set ourselves some really amazing and I think quite challenging targets as a practice, ones that we think are critical to our future as a profession. And we're still on that journey and evolving, moving through that journey. One of the key sort of steps that we've done and hoping to take sort of refurbishment and retrofit to the next level is looking at material passporting. This is an open source project that we're undertaking with a number of partners, Elliott Wood, Arup, HETA and the Grosvenor Estate. And we're wanting to essentially really jumpstart the circular economy and create a system that everyone can buy into and really help that to move forward. We see this as the next step in our journey through retrofit, and we feel that we want everyone to be involved in this, and that's why we've created something that's open source. So I'd like to thank you for listening to me today. Hopefully that you managed to get some sort of insight into how we went about these things and why we went about these things. They're two very different outcomes from two 1970s office buildings and buildings that we're very proud of. So I hope you enjoyed seeing them. Thank you.
Well, I certainly enjoyed seeing them. I was particularly impressed by that idea that you can turn a basement not just into usable space, but into such desirable space. I wanted to ask, I know in the past there was a time when a lot of people worried about adapting buildings from the 1970s because they found that the floor to ceiling heights were too low for all the services that at that point they needed. How do you find that now?
I think it's a constantly evolving conversation, actually. With the standard, we saw the low ceiling heights as the opportunity. They were very low and prohibitive, so we felt the best use was to actually port it to a hotel where you didn't have as much horizontal service distribution. With other projects, we really, I think it boils down to how well we can collaborate with our MEP colleagues, actually. We have a few sort of trusted collaborators that we work with in a really collegiate manner to try and come up with creative solutions for such difficult buildings. I said at the start of the piece about how we enjoy the challenge, and that's very much part of it. And we work on a number of 70s buildings, even back actually the 1930s building at 1 New Oxford Street, where you have 10-foot floor to floors, and we worked to get a raised access floor zone of 70 millimeters with micro ducting underneath it to try and keep the air away from the ceiling, keep everything as clean as possible. So we have different aspects to different projects. We want to work in a sort of ultra practical way where we can make beauty out of everything within the project.
Well, you certainly made beauty there. Just very quickly, you showed us 2 buildings, and I think we'd all agree that the second one was of less original architectural merit than the first, and that was where you needed a larger intervention. Do you think that's generally true, that the less good buildings need more change?
Not necessarily. I think that we work in a commercial world, and we work with commercial developers. Each project has different briefs, different merits, different things that we try and interrogate as we enter a project, and try and we always review a project in sort of 5 tenets, if you like, in principles, where we're trying to kind of understand our sort of sense of custodianship, how we deal with details in an ultra practical manner, how we build our relationships with our clients, our collaborators, and how we what are the sort of deep assignments within the projects. And I think both projects there had sort of varying deep assignments, if you will, where you get right into the forensic detail of the project. The 160 Old Street, a lot of the client took a risk with that site and that building, and one of the key sort of commercial gains was actually that we extended the area of the building and drove value through area extension. On other projects, we drive value through the use of data and technology. There's lots of different ways we cut and carve each project and reimagine things.
There's obviously a lot more to say, and we are going to have the opportunity to talk about it more at the end. And we are getting some great questions coming in. I just remind everyone, you still can send in questions to Andrew, and as you hear our next speakers, you can send those in as well. We've had a great architectural presentation. We are now going to go on to an engineer, and I'm delighted now to introduce Amy Punter, who is an Associate Director with Hoare Lea. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you for having me today. I know I've just been introduced. I'm Amy. I'm one of the Associate Directors in Hoare Lea's London office. Having spent 6 to 7 years working on historic buildings, the topic of adapting buildings for future use is of particular interest to me. Today I'm going to focus on the retrofit of historic buildings from the perspective of the building services engineer. As part of this, I'm also aiming to respond to the question I'm posing at the start here. Can historic buildings join the race to net zero? I'm going to explain this using 2 case studies, with an overview of each and a brief virtual walk around. I'll then be closing with my attempt to answer my own question. So on to the first case study. Old Admiralty Building is located in the heart of London on Horse Guards Parade. It comprises 24,000 metres squared of office space, which has been modernised for use by a new incoming government department. 2 of its famous former occupiers are Winston Churchill and Ian Fleming. I'm mentioning these for no other reason other than I just think that's an interesting fact. Our multidisciplinary team was working alongside Mace and BDP for the government to deliver the project. Our brief was primarily to modernise the existing Grade 2 listed office to enable the government to continue use of the building for many years to come. However, a particular challenge was to overcome some of the overheating issues that were present in a lot of areas of the building, whilst also increasing the number of occupants, nigh on doubling in fact. We needed to achieve this, all whilst improving connectivity by opening up the otherwise cellular rooms. Through review and consideration of the brief and potential responses to it with the design team, we ultimately opted to provide new electrical services throughout and full mechanical ventilation and cooling throughout as well. Only the existing heating system was retained with its connection to the district heating network. Before introducing any new services, we needed to bring down the load on the building. We did this by the introduction of secondary glazing. This was one of the only major interventions permissible in the historic fabric, but enabled us to bring the load down on the chillers, which was fundamental to making the project a success. We also introduced mechanical ventilation plant, which had integral heating and cooling functionality, which also further brought down that load on the chillers. Now on to the first virtual tour. So I could talk about this project for hours, but I'm going to try and condense it to a few minutes. So I'm going to focus on a couple of innovative solutions that we came up with the architecture and design team to overcome some of the particular challenges presented to us by this historic fabric. One of the first challenges was how to integrate 2 10-ton air-cooled chillers somewhere in this building. Now, as you can imagine, roof space was at a particular premium, so the only real option was somewhere in this courtyard. But in reality, we had to keep out of this courtyard as far as we could because the Queen's carriage turns around here on the parade days. So it was decided that we put the chillers in this light well over on the right-hand side here, which, as you can see from this angle, is quite unobtrusive. But when you get up close and personal at this balustrade here, at the edge of the courtyard, you can, of course, see them, but we look to mitigate the impact still by sinking them down. So there's 5 stories from the top of the roof there down to the bottom, which is great from a visual impact perspective on the rest of the courtyard, but not great from a services perspective because of the risk of recirculation of the air, with the warm air off the top being drawn back down into the intakes, which incurs a risk of derating the performance of these pieces of equipment. So to overcome this, we engaged in an iterative design process with the architect and the rest of the design team to come up with this bespoke architectural lid solution. So this is solid from the back wall here to about 2/3 of the way up the length of the chillers. And then we have the ductwork sections off the top, which helps to direct and push the air further up out of the way, thus mitigating the risk of recirculation. So as we move into the building, I really wanted to show you all these corridors. They are some of the most historically significant features of the building. As you can see from these amazing mosaic floors, the ornate arches, it was paramount that we kept our services out of them as far as we possibly could. So these are where the messengers used to run up and down between the offices of the naval officers of the Admiralty before the invention of fax and email. So in keeping with getting our services out of these corridors, we had to limit the crossovers from the cores to the offices to certain locations, and we took to tuck them up into the arches as far as we could. Now, this was a challenge from a coordination perspective, given the different levels, the different structural conditions all over the place, and the different size of the services. But we worked really hard with the design team, spending days on site, looking at every different individual solution, and I think the result is, we're pleased with the result. So as we move into the offices, you have this floating raft solution above us. I call it a floating raft because it started life as a bulkhead pushed to the back wall and up to the soffit. So the architect went through a lot of negotiations with the conservation officers, working hard to pull them away from the soffit and the wall to reveal these cornices, and hence it became the floating raft. We then introduced a bespoke solution to the fan coil unit enclosures, where we undertook manufacturer testing with the ceiling, grill and fan coil unit suppliers to come up with a solution that pushed the fan coil units as far back to the raft as we possibly could, thus minimising the visual impact in the space and how far they extended. So back onto the presentation and onto the next case study. So the reinvention of Sea Station was converting this 1920s International Radio Telegraph station on the left into a new secondary school near Rugby in Halton. Now, I like these before and after shots. They're about 100 years apart, but I think they really demonstrate how sensitively the new school has been adapted. Well, so the existing radio station was adapted into this new scheme. We worked with a multidisciplinary team to deliver the project for Urban and Civic at the heart of their new Halton development. As Sea Station was falling rapidly into disrepair, it was important to preserve its presence and cultural significance as the heart of the new Halton development of just over 6,000 homes and a new civic centre. Converting Sea Station into a new secondary school as part of this new community was an opportune means to realise this vision and brief. A key part of the success of this reinvention was the ability of the architect to align the new use of the space, of the new use, to the form of the existing spaces. The power hall in its former condition is shown on the left 2 photos here. This contained 6 engines which powered the transmission hall on the right-hand photo here. The power hall generally, on the left, generally comprised one whole story with a small mezzanine level, whereas the transmission hall generally comprised 2 stories, but each with significantly varying heights. You can see the form of the buildings better on this view, and the power hall is on the left, transmission hall on the right. So the power hall now comprises the school auditorium and the dining hall, whereas the transmission hall has now been divided into 5 stories containing the theatre and activity studios, art classrooms and sixth form space. There are 3 new buildings on the site as well. 2 of them are the new teaching blocks, and then the left-hand side is the new sports hall. So on to the next virtual tour. I wanted to show you the power hall because I think it's a good demonstration of how we coordinated the plant areas with the architect and the existing architecture to best respond to the historic features of the spaces. So as you can see, we've coordinated all of the services with these existing steel beams, which we wanted to celebrate, of course. And we also looked to avoid, where possible, interrupting the secondary glazed windows, and the roof lights at high level. So what we did was we double stacked our plant room right at the end of the dining hall here, and this helped to minimise the footprint of the plant room whilst utilising the full height of the space, making the most of that height. We also looked to do that to try and mitigate taking up too many of the windows and reveal as many as we could, but unfortunately a couple did fall into the demise of the plant room. But we looked to best use these by integrating intake and exhaust louvers into these existing openings. So on the face of it, you might say that's an issue because we have impacted the windows, but in reality there was a key driver as well to not create additional holes in the fabric if we could avoid it. So I've talked to you a little bit about the services integration within each of these buildings, but what does this mean for carbon? I'm now going to attempt to answer my own question by running through the as-built performance of each of these case studies and where I think we collectively need to take the industry next. Noting the general position of the industry at the time, there were no whole-life carbon targets set for Old Admiralty. In fact, the carbon calcs we were held to were Part L EPC only, not the operational carbon targets, carbon calculations that we undertake today, which include all of the operational carbon, not just the regulated energy. Nonetheless, the improvements we made led to an estimated as-built 11% improvement over the heritage baseline building emission rate. We would have also achieved an as-built EPC of C rather than D had the district heating network carbon factors not worsened over the course of the project. A few years later, when we were designing Halton School, the world and its ambitions in terms of carbon had evolved. Required and aspirational energy consumption targets were set for the whole site, as it was imperative that energy consumption and therefore operational costs of the school were at a manageable level. As you can see from these images, the estimated as-built energy consumption for the whole site met the required target and were just shy of the aspirational. This achievement was made possible by the efforts to reduce the air permeability before we even introduced any services incurring an operational load. As you can see from the figures on the right, this was a particular achievement in the power hall, which is one of the listed elements of the building, which achieved the aspirational target of less than 3. The picture now in our industry has evolved further still. We understand that the UK government will soon be ramping up pressure on the non-domestic sector by introducing a performance rating system for all existing buildings, thus encouraging appropriate retrofit to reduce energy use. This is a snippet from the UK Green Building Council's Whole Life Carbon Roadmap, which indicates how this might be introduced over the next decade, starting with offices and then moving through the other sectors. In addition to this, there are proposed targets coming in the form of guidance which is under development by Letty and Sibsey as part 3 of their retrofit guide. As a side note, if you'd like to hear more about that, I'm involved, so do drop me a note afterwards. Now, we would expect the targets for heritage buildings to be different to modern retrofit. However, to what degree? So this might be somewhat controversial, but I'm going to pose a question to you all. Do you think we will and or should start to see a greater degree of interventions permitted in order to strive towards the aspirational carbon targets of the nation and the world? We of course always want interventions to be mindful of the preservation of the architectural and historical significance of these buildings, but will that balance shift between the intervention and the performance as wider cultural priorities change? Whether this balance shifts or not, it's still worth noting that there are absolutely things we can do to reduce the energy consumption in these existing buildings. And with the now widely recognised inherent benefits of retaining and retrofitting rather than demolishing and rebuilding, we will likely and hope to see a greater appetite for these types of projects going forward. Route maps such as this one can be used as a step-by-step guide to driving down energy consumption and carbon emissions. The first few steps are the application of passive measures, like the ones we've already talked about, such as improving the building fabric to reduce the energy demand before we introduce any new services at all. Once the building energy demand is reduced, we then need to look to ways to move away from fossil fuel and into electric-driven heat sources. Now, this poses a particular challenge in buildings like this because the heat pumps that are often used for this require either connection to atmosphere, land, or water. By land, I mean buried. So you can't just bury a load of boilers somewhere in a basement with a couple of flues sticking out the building. So innovations such as the chiller one at Old Admiralty are going to be key to moving this type of technology forward in these buildings. A full understanding of and appreciation for the history of the building is also fundamental to sensitively integrating any new services that are required. And finally, to evaluation, offset and optimisation. Post-occupancy evaluation and optimisation will be key to the successful reduction of energy consumption and carbon emissions. If the systems that we're introducing aren't functioning as required, then all of the efforts to retrofit them into a building are futile. Furthermore, we all need to be gathering, sharing and learning from these retrofit projects in order to collectively improve and drive the industry forward at the pace required. So to answer my own question that I posed at the start, I believe the answer is yes. Historic buildings can help in the race to net zero carbon. This is an image taken from Historic England's website. It's an interactive map, and I've zoomed in on an area of London, central London, which shows the number of historic buildings in that area. The blue triangles are historic buildings. As the case studies I've talked about have shown, a difference can be made in the performance of these buildings. And whilst deferring to exemptions from building regs and the like may of course still be required in the retrofit of historic buildings, we shouldn't feel afraid to look for ways to challenge and innovate in order to propel the retrofit of historic buildings forward to positively contribute to the carbon agenda. If we successfully adapt historic buildings for the future and drive down their carbon emissions, it stands to reason, given the quantum of blue triangles shown here alone, that we'd make a significant difference in the race to net zero whilst preserving these amazing buildings for the benefit of generations to come. That's all from me. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for giving us such an inspiring presentation. You talked near the end about this question of whether more intervention should be allowed in historic buildings if we're to improve performance. And I wonder what else you would have liked to do in the two buildings that you showed if you'd been allowed to.
That is an interesting question. I think for Old Admiralty, this could be would be quite extreme, but there are often talked about benefits of doing mixed mode ventilation rather than just full mechanical ventilation to bring your loads down in the mid-seasons. And a way I wondered to do this would be to integrate and mimic the cavity ventilation in the walls, the air bricks, mimic that appearance and introduce more openings and use those, punch through to the spaces and use those to bring air through in the mid-seasons for mixed mode ventilation. That's quite, the quantum of the vents required would be quite high, but it would be interesting to understand in the future if that kind of thing would be accepted if we demonstrated a big enough carbon saving. I think on Halton, The power hall had an enormous flat roof, which would be great to put PVs on. I think that was discussed early in the design stages and viewed too impactful, particularly with the views from the transmission hall down. But again, going forward, if we're going to drive these energy performance figures down and down and down, maybe that's the balance that would be struck. It's an industrial building, so having industrial type appearance things on the roof is kind of in keeping, and it's just moving it forward and ensuring it can be used for generations.
But at the level where you were allowed to do things, did you compare the performance of those two altered buildings with the new buildings that you put on the same site? Were they better or worse?
Yeah, we did compare. So in terms of carbon across a year, the existing buildings were up at 22 kilograms of carbon per metre square per year, which on the face of it does seem high. But when you look at the new buildings that we're achieving on average, it's just around 6 kilograms of CO2. That is obviously a lot lower. But the interesting point is that if we had put air source heat pumps in to the existing buildings, we would have been down at 7, which is obviously nigh on equivalent to the new builds, which is really quite interesting because we're dealing with historic fabric here. The reason air source heat pumps weren't put in at the time were on the grounds of cost. I wonder if that would change now when we can demonstrate the carbon benefits with today's carbon factors. Having done that exercise with the project team as well, it's thrown up some interesting questions about what measures might be put in place in certain contracts through the construction stage to encourage the contractors to have to demonstrate the performance of the building over a number of years, not just the commissionability at the time leading up to PC and then an air permeability test. If they are held to demonstrate energy performance over a number of years, that's where this is going to start to get, I think, more interesting, because the air permeability of those existing buildings and the improvements made were really powerful, down to nigh on 3, just under 3. How far could we push the new builds? Could we get down to 1? I think we could.
That would be interesting to see. And again, we can talk later. I just remind everybody, do keep sending your questions in. And before we get to our general discussion, I'm delighted to introduce our third and final speaker, who is Donald Matheson, Director of Matheson Whiteley. Donald.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about one of our adaptive reuse projects, Studio Voltaire. We've actually been working quite a lot with existing buildings quite often in the creative industries, working with artists who I think in themselves have sort of pioneered the adaptive reuse of buildings with character. You think about Donald Judd and his studio in New York in Spring Street, and the obviously much more significant examples like Tate Modern. So it's wonderful to be continuing that kind of focus in some of the projects we've done. Before I speak about Studio Voltaire, I thought I would just show a couple of other projects which I think, just reflecting on it, have sort of a common aspect in that they all incorporate some form of repair or essential repair. And it's interesting how we've, I suppose, found that strategically those can actually give quite strong architectural character to the project. So that's an interesting thing that I think has been consistent in some of the work we've been doing. First sort of brief project I'll talk about is, or example rather, is an arts gallery which is a conversion of these buildings, which the found character is quite varied and as you can see sort of unloved, and there were aspects of essential repair here, one of which was to give sort of protection to the existing facade, and by using protective brick treatment we were able to sort of bind together the group of buildings and give them this sort of singular character, this singular identity. which in itself was, I think, one important aspect because of the setting of the building, of the project, which was next to a fairly significant church by Nicholas Hawksmoor in Clerkenwell. At the same project required new insulated glazing to a set of roof lights. In the process of doing that, we looked at using traditional wired glass as part of the double glazed unit. Other than the sort of huge benefit to the thermal performance of the building, the wired glass provides this sort of diffuse natural light quality, which means that the exhibition spaces have this really appropriate sort of condition for the display of paintings in particular. Another project is a mixed-use development we completed recently in Forest Gate in East London, which is a building that had a very sort of solid basis to it, and again there were some aspects of repair required there, along with the addition of a lightweight extension to form additional sort of volume. And there we found the act of repair to the existing building combined with a material that would sit on a much lighter weight extension on the roof. We found this insulated render system, which is used directly onto the brickwork of the existing base building. And again, it's a kind of interesting result in that it has this sort of singular, fresh architectural identity, which at the same time is giving the building some longevity. Another brief example is a sort of slightly more disruptive approach to repair. Is a site where we were working with a series of buildings, some of which had this sort of character, storage buildings, useful storage buildings or workshop buildings. And the project here was actually to remove them rather than reuse them, and in their place form a very efficient sort of version of those buildings, a new industrial building. And the strategic sort of move here is to provide a really functional building that our client could establish their business on the site while over much longer period of time focus on the restoration of this arts and crafts building by Edward S. Pryor, and this has been converted into a family home. So yeah, much more sort of broad, I suppose, interpretation of the act of repair on a kind of site-wide scale. But again, it's something that's delivered a kind of really fresh architectural identity through that, combined with that act. So our project for Studio Voltaire is located in South London. This is actually an aerial view, just to give you a location, and this is Clapham High Street with the sort of edge of Clapham Common here. So it's in quite a varied existing context of residential buildings and larger industrial buildings. And as you would walk past it prior to the refurbishment, you might notice this chapel, which was an exhibition building, and actually it was the potentially the only part of the organisation, or the only place where the organisation could sort of engage with the public. Studio Voltaire are a not-for-profit organisation that support and provide artist studios and have a programme of exhibitions to sort of support that and give some engagement with the local community as well as sort of wider artistic community. And they had developed a very strong reputation for supporting artists at the very earliest point in their careers, some of which have gone on to do incredibly well and be involved in like Turner Prize winners and that sort of thing, which is wonderful. And they've been working on this site for around 25 years and had got to a point where they had enough support and resources to think about a major capital project to significantly upgrade the existing buildings. In a way, there was no question about any replacement of those buildings. I think they had found that the character of these buildings was very much sort of part of their identity as an organisation, particularly the chapel. But I think the thing to mention in this photograph is that their site was fairly extensive beyond the initial first impression. There's a hint of it if you passed and the gates were open. You would see this sort of quite functional yard, and beyond that some additional buildings, and this is the full extent of their site. So the chapel is a relatively small part, even though that was often all the public really got to experience when they visited for an exhibition. And the industrial buildings behind, we sort of categorised them tall bay and low bay. They're workshop buildings or industrial buildings that have been reappropriated, and these are some examples or some images from the site as we sort of started to work with it. Just an accumulation of sort of fairly unplanned and ad hoc studio separation, all in the sort of context of quite problematic building fabric issues principally with the roof of the building. As you saw from the diagram, those roofs are quite extensive, and there's issues with asbestos, there's issues with lack of insulation, issues with water management. They leaked quite extensively. So whereas the organisation had established a presence on the site and they'd established a sort of programme and a really vital sort of place to provide space, an affordable space for artists, the thing that they were having to wrestle with was the conditions in which those artists had to work. And I think there were a few basic issues over warmth and having some sort of security and things like that were the priorities around the capital project that we became involved in through a limited competition. The competition actually was organised by the Architecture Foundation, and it was a really rare invitation for quite new practices to have a chance to compete through a design competition for a public building, which I think, just in terms of the procurement process that young practices have to engage with in the UK, this is increasingly sort of rare, and we're very grateful for the opportunity. And I think we potentially were successful because we had this sort of experience of working with existing buildings and the sort of particular sensitivities around display of art and what artists might need, and took a very practical approach just in terms of the sort of understanding of what the budget would be sort of dedicated towards, and that one significant part of that budget was going to be the replacement of the roof to deal with those practical issues. And one thing we noticed is that in the process of replacing that roof, it was possible to make some quite relatively modest adjustments, not replacing existing structure, but actually working in the logic of the existing structure, and in doing so we could generate enough volume to create a quite significant additional floor area on a mezzanine level, which sort of capitalises on the long clear spans that the existing industrial structure was offering. And just in terms of the sort of iterative process that we sort of engaged, together with the client and the engineers and other people involved in the project, this is an early model, but the sort of character of this roof did develop, I think, from something that's read as a real separate object, something that had, I suppose, more playful architectural character, into something that started to actually resemble very much the shapes and profiles of the existing roofs. I think that was very much because of the desire to really minimise the costs related to adaptation of the structure, and it was really working with the existing logic of that structure that led us to this. And I think we started to feel that there was quite a nice result from this, that the sort of changes at the roof level really diminished in terms of the visual impact, and they were quite subtle, and I think it felt completely appropriate that the sort of significant visual sort of image of the project remains the chapel, and it actually is now complemented by an artwork which is a refurbishment of a new public garden by the artist Anthea Hamilton, which is a conversion of this existing yard, and I'll talk a little bit more about the significance of that yard and its new role as the main entrance to the site. I mean, I mentioned about the sort of visibility of the whole site. This was actually the sort of just very basic diagrammatic expression of what a visitor would experience. They had the opportunity to visit the gallery, and there were problems with that because there were level changes and so it wasn't fully accessible. There was the yard that was sort of forgotten, and there was the studios, which were, to all intents and purposes, pretty invisible, although every now and then you would maybe get a sense of the activity if you walk through some of those sort of labyrinthine corridors through there. And our approach was actually to utilise the yard and the natural level change that it offered to bring visitors in deeper in the site and at the level of the floor of the gallery, making the whole site actually for the first time completely accessible to all. And the addition of the mezzanine that I showed in the section, that had fairly significant impact in that we sort of hit the provision of studio target in a way that meant other parts of the ground floor could be dedicated to other uses, other supporting uses, and those range from a retail sort of a new shop, a cafe, education space, which sits in this part of the site in conjunction with a new garden, which is in itself is a sort of opportunity that came about looking at demolishing some of the existing, giving up some of the existing built volume for something that was, again, pretty vital, some external space. And also a series of sort of social spaces that can be used in different ways, semi-public, let's say, in terms of studio users having the opportunity to come together. Just very, very quickly, this is the plan. I think the only real thing to say is that this is the yard. This is a new cafe space. Off that is the vertical circulation, which is a lift and stair. This is the sort of block of accommodation that's sort of formed in the structural adjustment, and this is the set of studios on the mezzanine. I'll just take you through some of the completion photographs. This is the approach and the sort of new front door, access to the garden. This is the garden by Anthea Hamilton, which is on a slight slope and has this sort of wonderful inventive use of common and quite sort of exotic materials. There's another artist commission actually a bit deeper in the building with the public toilets. So these two really significant moments of intense sort of colour and creativity it's great that those are the sort of headline moments, if you like, that it's not so much our work, we're sort of supporting that technically, but it's the creativity comes from the artists who are kind of what the project's all about, really. The cafe space is sort of defined by two beams which sort of reflect the existing the character of the existing structure. This is actually an image of the chapel as it was found, so you can see these stairs that people had to negotiate to visit exhibitions. Those stairs are now gone as the access is on level. Otherwise, the space is pretty much unchanged, which I think is quite a nice aspect of the project. It didn't need anything really. It was a wonderful space as it was. We had the opportunity actually, because of just the sort of support we got from the client, to do an early strip out, which gave us the opportunity to document the existing condition quite precisely, as the building was actually, the project was delivered in BIM, so a digital twin BIM model was developed by all the design team working together, and the contractors worked directly off that model to build, rather than sets of paper drawings. They worked off devices to access the single model environment. And that allowed quite a focus on prefabrication, so all the internal partitions, as well as being sort of alleviated of some practical requirements through quite a sort of lot of work on fire strategy. The components are quite lean, so a lot of prefabrication in terms of the METSEC frames to the partitions, but the leanness in terms of quantity of panels, etc., means that the quality of those panels can be lifted, and rather than being plasterboard, they're painted OSB panels, which give a sort of robustness and also a nice level of interchangeability. And in terms of the position and the setting out of those walls, it was quite deliberate to kind of reveal the sort of accidentally elegant backdrop of this wonderful industrial structure that was, retained. And I think we organised the structure the layout to offer quite long views, all of which sort of arrive at places of gathering or opportunities for gathering. So this is one space that is offered as a sort of artist's kitchen or social area, and it can also be used and has been used and is being used as sort of intermittent exhibition space by some of the groups who are working. This is one of the studios on the ground floor, so you can see they've been used in very different ways. This is a group called Action Space, who work with disabled groups to do workshops and that sort of thing, and they often spill out into the corridor spaces and the artist's kitchen to show what they're doing. This is an individual artist studio, so you can see some of the sort of retained masonry structure. The mezzanine itself, I mean, again, the sort of palette and the tone of our work was quite controlled, really, to really offer quite a sort of recessive backdrop to the space, and in the process of replacing the roof, there were other opportunities to introduce moments, like when you come around the lift on the stair, there's a glimpse into a adjacent sort of slightly wild garden behind the houses next door. And then on the mezzanine itself, these are the sort of images of the volume into which the mezzanine was inserted, and the fact that we were able to reuse, working with a good structural engineer, structural workshop, we were able to reuse the footings without any need for underpinning, despite the fact that the mezzanine itself is quite extensive. It was constructed in lightweight materials, and so again the structure sort of invited into these spaces with the fact that it's allowed to be seen rather than covered up with the positioning of the separation walls. And one other opportunity that the mezzanine offered was a sort of slightly new type of studio, which is a communal studio, which is obviously using that big span, but offers a different kind of space, non-enclosed space. So it's essentially these corners that are formed with non-full height partitions and a communal space in the centre that people can work together. Okay, thank you very much.
That was a great deal of thought that's gone into a very sensitive project. I'm interested to know how much it's done for the organisation. Have they noticed an increase in local awareness of its presence, or an increase in visitors since the job that you've done there?
Our client told us that shortly after the opening, there were some residents who actually had been living right next door for 25 years and had no idea on what was going on inside those buildings. So I think the large part of that is obviously the sort of idea that our client Studio Voltaire had to sort of put an artwork front and center in the refurbishment of the garden, and that's definitely drawn in people who otherwise would have walked past, or and what that leads to is in something that's to be seen. I think we can be confident that anyone who discovers what's going on there and wants to become involved can now sort of do so in much better conditions, in terms of the project focus being about supporting creativity and production. The conditions are now sort of much more suitable for that.
They obviously are, and it's more accessible for visitors. How much have you actually improved the environmental performance of the building?
Yeah, I think fairly significantly. I mean, I think buildings that were uninsulated are now fully insulated. The heating system sort of now centralized. We had the opportunity to sort of partly also to address the accessibility issue, to put in a completely sort of seamless concrete floor throughout the entire ground floor level, a new concrete floor with underfloor heating, which is run off two air source heat pumps, which are located on the roof area. So I think that is being monitored. I think the one significant thing I think is that the centralization of the heating system means that previous situation where studio users sort of did their own thing, had heaters or maybe just put up with the conditions, that's now not the case, and it can be monitored so much more precisely in terms of energy usage.
Well, that's obviously great progress. And I'm sure there's more to ask you. I've got questions here, but let's call our other speakers back in and we can start to have a more general discussion. Great, they're back. I've had a couple of questions actually addressed to different people amongst you, but one of them was saying, have you considered at some point the comparison between the costs of refurbishing an existing building and demolishing and building a new one? And another question, and I think it was addressed to some of Amy's projects, was that feeling that are you sometimes trying to put a square peg into a round hole? In other words, we all know that we should keep more buildings, but I think the question is, where does the point come when it's just too expensive to keep going, or the wins aren't worth it? And as a rider to that, I'd say, it's obvious just how much work and detailed thought you've put into solving a huge range of problems in these buildings. Whereas I'm guessing with a new build, it would just be more straightforward, not quite off the shelf, but you'd be doing things you've done before. So I'm going to start with Andrew on that.
And a lot of our clients will ask us to do that. If they want a new build, we'll try to kind of promote a retrofit alternative to that and make that as attractive. We do a lot of in-house sort of carbon assessments, which I think are really critical to this to the debate here. And I think we encourage our clients to review projects in terms both of capital cost and carbon cost. So there's a kind of evolution of how people perceive the projects, and where we can make the biggest gains in a project. That's where those sort of micro assessments and judgments within our architecture really add value.
And Amy, obviously, we talked earlier about how if you'd had the freedom to spend a bit more money, you could have actually got the environmental performance a great deal better on those rugby buildings. But do you feel sometimes that it's just not worth the effort, and that demolish and replace would be better, because you are balancing long term, aren't you, embodied carbon and operational carbon?
I think it depends. As Andrew said, it depends on each scheme and their merits. I mean, I was talking earlier about historic buildings. They obviously have a listed element. Both were grade 2 listed. So there's an important aspect to preserve them. But I think in terms of the wider retrofit, you don't want to necessarily always categorically retain if it's so costly, it's prohibitively costly to knock them down. Retain and modify rather than knock them down and rebuild. Then each scheme has to be considered on their own merits. I think it's a balancing act, and I think it's key to do collaborative feasibility studies from the off, as Andrew was saying. Looking at the whole life carbon of refitting and retaining versus demolition and rebuild. I think it's also really important to fit the use to the space. You mentioned, the question raised about, square peg, round hole. I think that's absolutely right. I think rather than trying to fit a use of a building that just doesn't work, then you're facing an uphill struggle from the off. Whereas the example of Horton, I think, is a really nice one, and that's why I wanted to touch upon the use of the space, because we knew that, the architect in the feasibility stage particularly knew that certain elements of the school do need big rooms. So rather than trying to completely change the use that didn't need big rooms, then you fitted the form, and I think it worked really well in that scenario.
I've got a couple of questions that will come in for Donald. We touched briefly on environmental improvements, but somebody's asked, how did the project deal with zero carbon approaches? And the fabric of old and new parts. And I suppose what's behind this is you can make them better, but can you make them better enough? And also, somebody's interested to know a bit more about the insulated render system that you used. So that's a general question and a more specific one.
Maybe I'll take the second one first. Yeah, the insulated render, that project was sort of two parts. There was a brick existing 2-story building that we were retaining, which had been sort of abused over its life, and we needed to protect it somehow. And then there was a lightweight timber frame roof extension, and so we wanted to find a single material that would sort of bind the two systems together, if you like. So our client, actually, who was from southern Germany, it's a project that actually we developed like as a joint venture with a client, and they had a familiarity with this Tyrolean render system, which for them was something with sort of associations with very high quality buildings, and it's a lumpy, aggregate heavy, self-colored render. And in looking harder at that, we learned that could be applied directly onto the brickwork with an insulated lining internally to the new spaces, and then on the roof it could be applied to rock wool, to an insulated system. So it's in two different conditions, but you wouldn't know it really to look at the building from the outside. So again, it delivered technically, and I think in terms of the architectural expression that we're looking for. And I think in terms of the first question about sort of whole impact on
about getting to zero carbon, can you get anywhere near?
That's a difficult question to answer until we sort of consider all the costs really of everything that we're doing. I think we found that every design decision that comes up, and I think that the use of BIM quite often means that you're making those design decisions a bit earlier in the process with slightly maybe more controlled conditions, and discovering things as you reveal the condition of an existing building in the construction process. Certainly, we're making decisions on a design basis, but you have to definitely include in the decision-making process, the impact. So I think we're at the sort of gestation of that as part of our practice. I think we're trying to really work very, very hard to think about those things, every strategic and detailed design decision that we make. But I think in Studio Voltaire it was interesting because I think there was a real shared endeavour to try and, whether it was a structural solution or like I mentioned about reusing the footings and not introducing, significant quantities of concrete to the project and keeping things quite lightweight, and the drive for prefabrication, which was sort of an advantage of the way that we were digitally modelling the building, meant that we could really be quite serious about cutting back on waste and transportation costs and things like that. So I think it's not a zero carbon project, I don't think, because there's cost there, but we're in the process and right across the design team, everybody's definitely trying to make the right sort of working with the right instincts.
You talked quite interestingly about the use of BIM there, and we've had a question in from somebody who picked up on the fact that one of our speakers, I'm afraid remember which it was, talked about digital twins, and the question is, how widespread is their use, and I suppose how valuable are they on projects like this? I'm going to come to Amy first.
So I think it was actually Donald that talked about the digital twin. But I think we are seeing them more and more. I think certain projects, so on Old Admiralty, we had an issue. We couldn't do a Revit model because of the security constraints of the building at the time when we were doing the design. So certain aspects like that prevent a digital twin being used. But I think when we see the progression of design for performance coming in with neighbours and the performance rating system that the government are looking to put into place this year, I think we'll start to see them more and more on projects, because you want to verify that the performance of the building through its life actually is working as designed. So, don't need to reinvent the wheel, continue that model through. And it can be a sort of live, progressive digital twin of the building.
Andrew, what about you? What about your projects?
I agree with Amy. It's becoming more and more prevalent, and I think it's an educational thing throughout the construction industry and with our clients as well. I think a lot of it is getting sort of facilities management teams of offices on board as using the digital twin as a tool, and how it can be used to measure design for performance as well. So yeah, it's happening, but it hasn't really sort of taken foot on more than a few projects within our office at the moment. I think 160 Old Street was interesting because their client was really interested in that and wanted to, one of his ambitions was they were to create a really truly smart building, and they have been doing a lot of post-occupancy evaluation work there. So that's what a sort of great example of that.
I must come back to Donald's apologies that I didn't recall that it was your project that was talking about digital twins, but it's interesting that I think this is happening in a project where I would call this project both ambitious and modest at the same time. You've made an impact, but you obviously haven't made that impact by sort of sticking on some great new whizzy thing. It's very subtle. And I suppose a few years ago, you just wouldn't have had that level of technological ambition. But is this something you feel that you can really take through all these projects now?
I think what's interesting for us about Studio Voltaire is we had so much support from the client in terms of, I suppose, a level of trust in a way, that a way of working and a way of organizing the program actually, in terms of when they would leave the building and when we could start the strip out process. gave us the opportunity to, just back to one thing that I think Andrew said at the very beginning of his about getting to know these existing buildings. We sort of had quite a rare chunk of time to really document and analyze that building, which is a sort of process that's almost demanded by the way of designing and working digitally, but it just gives you such knowledge and understanding of the capacity of the existing building, as well as its character and its appearance. And when I say capacity, I mean, can it hold a mezzanine? It turns out it can hold quite a significant mezzanine, and that's for that project. I think in terms of how money was being spent, that was quite significant. That it could deliver a real significant uplift in the floor area, which completely supported the client's business plan and ambitions, and it wasn't at the cost of having to introduce a lot of material and sort of structural gymnastics. It was really just using what was already there, but we could only really do that by understanding it. So I think now with other existing building or adaptive reuse projects, it's always important to really consider the design time process to make sure that you can really kind of ask all those questions and bottom out the sort of numerous design decisions in order to support the various ambitions. And it's very critical that one of those ambitions is about energy conservation.
It's interesting also, you talked about having a lightweight timber top to the building, and someone came in with a question for Andrew about whether or not you thought about using timber in your infill. And obviously now, with a lot of new buildings, for many architects, timber will be the first go-to that they'll try to think about because of its obvious environmental advantages. And I wonder, just quickly before we call it to a halt, whether it's more difficult to use a material like that on an existing building where you feel that you're having to knit in with a structure that's already there. Andrew?
I think in terms of using timber, one of the things we're constrained with was how much steel we can thread through the building and the spans that we created around that, and it wouldn't have worked technically for timber. And that's at the heart of what we try and do. We kind of are really interested in the story of the building and where people's sort of emotional attachment to that building lies. We don't want to do something for the sake of doing it because it feels like you're ticking a box or it might feel better. People always make the place, and that emotional attachment to a building is the sort of architectural superfood, and we need to up the experience of a building as we renovate it and rework it. And we don't want to just be box ticking. We've got to do the right thing for each.
There certainly wasn't any box ticking, I think, on any of these projects we've seen. I think what I really would like to do is just call this to a close. Obviously, thank Andrew McEwan, Amy Punter, Donald Matheson, who've all given us such stimulating presentations and so much to think about and such a great discussion. Also to thank our programme partners, Schu, and our audience for both watching and being so engaged. And until the next event, which we certainly hope to see you at, just thank everyone very much again and say goodbye.